Good afternoon and good morning, depending where you are. My name is Ines Steffens. I'm the editor-in-chief of Eurosurveillance. And on behalf of the Eurosurveillance team, I would like to warmly welcome everyone who's here in the room, but also those who are following us on their screens. We're a bit late, owed to other sessions running over, but I think we're right in time to start. And just one, because to cut in the interest of time, we will not do great presentations at the beginning and giving you all our CVs. Our CVs and the CVs of the speakers, more importantly, are online. You can find them on the swap card and you can find them on the Escaida card. Now I would like to call on our chief scientist, chair of the Escaida Scientific Committee, and Eurosurveillance associate editor, Piotr Kramasz, who kindly agreed to say a few words of welcome. Piotr, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Ines. I'm really proud to be here and stand in front of you and be able to say a few words. And I also would like to greet all the colleagues who are connecting online. I know there are many of you, and thanks for being with us. This part of Escaida is growing, definitely. I have so much to say at this conference that I have actually notes, but I can declare that no artificial intelligence was used to develop these notes. The topic is diversity and inclusion in research and scholarly publishing, and I'm looking forward to the presentations of our distinguished speakers, Shirin, Heidari, and Gowri, Gopalakrishna. I've been following, of course, the Eurosurveillance seminars, and I saw the growth over time. I know they included not only timely and forward-looking topics, but some controversial ones. And they were always done by excellent experts and well-known speakers. I have some examples of those seminars. The forward-looking topics included on the agenda were, for example, changing urban environments or using artificial intelligence. The more timely topics were communicating science, which you hear a lot about at this conference, also point-of-care testing. A controversial topic was, for example, should we fire healthcare workers who decline vaccination? But coming back to the topic of this seminar, it's extremely important. It's the inclusion, it's the diversity and inclusion topics. They serve to ensure the equity and reduce social inequalities. And there is a lot of emphasis on this, not only for publishing, it's everywhere. We have it as one of the main topics now at ECDC. We think about it also when we think about Escaida participation, how to make it as inclusive as possible. But now we will focus on the context of research and reporting. We need to consider, of course, when we develop our research and submit for publication, a number of factors. Our research has to be relevant, it's public health. It has to be well accepted and trusted, but it has to do no harm. And as epidemiologists, we look at time, place, person, but we also look at the issues of age, sex, gender, sometimes race, ethnicity. But even if we think about it, we may still have some blind spots when we do this. So this seminar will serve, I hope, us all. We hopefully would be able to maybe find some of these blind spots. I definitely hope that I will find some of mine. So with that, I would like to start now. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for these kind words of introduction and setting the scene for the seminar. And now I would like to introduce my co-chair or co-moderator. And this is Matthew Kuehnert, who is the deputy editor of the Emerging Infectious Diseases journal, published by the US CDC. And while most of you will think, what are these competitors doing here? We're not competitors, we're brother and sister journals. We're both interested in public health and advancing public health and the control and prevention of infectious diseases. Thanks, Matthew, for coming all the way from Atlanta to cold and snowy Stockholm, and over to you.
Oh, my pleasure to be here. We have an exciting session today. First, some housekeeping. We have two talks, which will be keeping to time and very much looking forward to them. And we'll be holding the discussion until after both presentations. The discussion will be hybrid, so Ines will handle online questions and I will handle questions from the in-person audience. We encourage you to participate and please introduce yourself before your question. First, before the presentations, we're going to have a poll with 3 questions. There's a QR code, which, yes, now there's a QR code. And for those online, there'll be a link in the chat for the poll. So,
Take pictures. You can't see the screen. I think you can just.
And while you're doing the poll, I go down and take pictures so we can see the poll results later on.
okay, so the first question, what do you associate with diversity, equity, and inclusion in research and reporting of science? So this will be a word cloud, and we'll give you 30 seconds. And as with these type of things, they're experiments. So if they don't work, we move on to the next experiment. Oh, good. Great. Okay, let's conclude that. Do you want to discuss the results because I can't see them?
You go first.
They should be here on the
Oh, okay. Oh, excellent. Very good.
Okay, great. Oh, we can't see what you can see.
Okay, so, yes. Oh, this is great. So we have a large number of responses for minorities, gender, fairness, representation, representativeness. These are all themes that will be discussed during the presentation, so thank you for that. Okay, next question. Okay. Should the editorial board of a journal always have an equal representation of men and women? Yes, no, it depends. I have no preference, or I've never thought about this. So, 30 seconds for responses. Thank you.
This is growing. What is that second one? What is it? It depends. Is it? It depends. I can't see. You got work to do. You got 43%. It depends.
Do you want to put the next one on? You want to read it out?
Yeah, good idea.
Okay, so the responses are in, and the result, almost a majority. We have a plurality, but yes, 48%. There should be an equal representation. 34% it depends, 9% no. 6% no preference, and 3% never thought about this. Let's move on to the next question, our final question. Should race be a variable in all research? Yes, no, it depends. I've never thought about this.
Because I was just thinking, I had a lot of conversation between Americans and Europeans, and race is a very intentional thing.
I always thought it was actually, a red flag word.
Especially when you think about biological.
Yes, exactly, which is, I'm a STEM researcher, I'm a biologist. Then I went into a meeting on research fairness with a group of theoretical astrophysicists.
Okay, I think we have about a stable number here. The answers are, as you could see, should race be a variable in all research? It depends. About 61%, yes, 22%, no, 15%, and haven't thought about it, 2%. So thank you for your participation in the poll during your salad. And multitasking is always challenging, but we appreciate it. So now I'll turn it over to my co-moderator.
Okay, thank you for taking part in the poll. And as you can see, there were some results that immediately sparked discussion here. So we're happy to be discussing them with you after the talk. And the next talk is Shirin Heidari. And Shirin and I, we realized we met first time in 2010. Then it was at the margins of the conference of the European Association of Science Editors, where over a coffee break, and we have heard a lot about the value of coffee breaks, we came together and discussed whether or not women were enough represented in research and science and editorial boards, and we weren't quite 100% of the same opinion and everything. And Shirin has moved on, and I moved on with her parts of her road. And from being an editor, from being an HIV researcher, now Shirin is the director of a non-for-profit organization, GENDRO, and she's still concerned, and she still works, and she's still spearheading research and showing people how important it is to consider sex and gender in scientific reporting and also planning. And so, Shirin, please.
Great. All right. Thank you so much. It is lovely to be back home in Stockholm, and I had forgotten how gray and cold it can be at this time of the year. So I hope that the heated debates and the coffee breaks keeps you warm. So I'm really delighted to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation to allowing me to speak about the SAGER guidelines and the path of developing these guidelines and how they have come to hopefully have a transformative potential in the way that we are conducting and reporting research. Now let me see how it works. There we go. I want to start, since we are obviously in the presence of so many researchers and public health professionals, to really underline and remind ourselves that evidence is the bedrock of public health policy and practice, and without evidence, we really stumble in the dark. Evidence is often generated through research and other systematic collection and analysis of data, and guides us through to take well-informed decisions based on facts and not assumptions towards meaningful solution. As an example, WHO, which is a normative authority in health, usually bases all its normative guidelines and recommendations from a systematic review of published literature and research and data to ensure that recommendations are rooted in strong and high quality research. Having said that, it's important to highlight as well that research and data collection, they're not neutral, objective, or free from values. They can be shaped by decisions about which studies receive funding, the framing of research questions, the methodologies that are chosen, the interpretations of results, and ultimately the selection of findings and interpretations that are going to be published. Now, gratefully, unfortunately, to my delight, there has been a growing recognition and awareness about the persistent and historical sex and gender biases in research, in particular medical and health research. And that is really important because we know that sex and gender are, and their intersection with other variables, and our next speaker will speak even more to that, are important determinants of health. Our biological sex, again defined by chromosomal composition, translated into differences in gene expression, hormonal profile, and immunological response, can influence our susceptibility to diseases, risk of diseases, manifestation of disease and presentation of symptoms, disease progression and recovery, immune system responses to autoantigens, pathogens and allergens, and even vaccines, and pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics and drug metabolism, and as such also treatment outcome. Gender, on the other hand, as a socially constructed multidimensional notion of that includes both identity as well as gender norms, roles, and relations, have also a wider influence on our overall health, including vulnerability to disease, exposure to risk and risk-seeking behavior, access, uptake, acceptability, and affordability of health services, health behavior, including health-seeking behavior, as well as availability and offering of prevention, treatment, and management options, and experience within the healthcare system. And there is obviously an interplay between sex and gender, so it's not always easy to distinguish between those. And again, we have a lot of work to understand those aspects. And just to also underline, and I'm sure that Gowri will talk more about that, that the notion of intersectionality is quite important as well. We know that both sex and gender, in particular in health, intersects with other dimensions, other variables, as well as other dimensions of inequality to result in differential experiences of health. Again, multiple social identities and systems of power within the society can create unequal distributions of power, privilege, and resources, again, offering different paths to health and health system and resulting in differential health and often health disparities. And gender, the notion of gender is really embedded in all our systems, our political system, our financial system, social, cultural system, and of course in our education, research, and health systems as well. In our health system, gender can really influence priorities given to women's, men's, and gender-diverse people's health services, and that goes with research as well. Decisions about which services should be offered. Sexual and reproductive health services are among those that have often been politicized and influenced based on gender stereotypes and patriarchal gender norms, as we have seen on and off again with the, again, change of the administrations in certain countries, no name. Resource allocation, quality of care, and experiences of sexism, racism, xenophobia, transphobia, homophobia, ableism, ageism within healthcare settings, and of course participation in decision-making about all of those above. And there are plenty of data to support more arguments as researchers. There is a study that has come out of the WHO that also strongly shows an association between gender inequality and vaccine coverage, showing that in countries that they rank higher in the gender equality index, they also have a greater immunization coverage. So again, there are plenty of research to showcase the association and the correlation between both gender equality as well as health outcomes. Now, having said all of that, our problem is that despite all this wealth of knowledge and activism and advocacy, we still are dealing with a rather androcentric health and research system where, again, our system privileges the perspectives of white male model. And the white male model has historically been point of reference, and women and marginalized populations have been excluded mostly from research for a variety of reasons that I will not go into right now. And of course, that creates gender-based gaps in evidence. And this is not something new. I really like to bring up this excerpt from The Lancet from 1973, it's 50 years ago, that highlights that gender and sex differences are well recognized in almost every area of medicine, but despite enormous growth of knowledge, they are still poorly understood. And 50 years later, we can still claim that we are not fully understanding these aspects in research. And a great example of that is COVID-19 pandemic, which was the second pandemic in my lifetime after the HIV, that really highlights the interplay of sex and gender. And very early on, we knew that men were at the greater risk of severe disease and death due to COVID, likely due to biological differences and biological reasons, but also related to potential gender-related behavioral aspect. Men are more likely to smoke, and that's, again, one risk factor. They might also be living more with comorbidities. On the other hand, as the pandemic evolved, women also found themselves to be more exposed and more vulnerable to COVID-19 due to their gender roles, as they often take caregiving responsibilities, both at home when the schools were closed down, taking care of children, taking care of elderly and adults, but also because they make up the majority of the frontline healthcare workers, and they were more frequently exposed to the viruses and to a larger volume of viruses as well. But there were a number of other gender-related factors that influence risk and again, experience of health. There was a very interesting article in the Washington Post stating that making men feel manly in masks is unfortunately a public health challenge of our time, which really highlights the notion of masculinity, how it can impact the compliance with non-pharmaceutical intervention. And there were other studies showing the same in terms of hand washing and distance taking. And of course, that doesn't apply to all men, but again, just to say that there are some tendencies. And likewise, in the healthcare settings, there were reports of ill-fitting personal protective equipments, not fitting women's anatomies and women's sizes, and also having very difficulties for women that had long shifting hours to manage menstrual hygiene during using these, that they were actually not fitted or designed for be used by women. And as well, at the time when the supply was scarce, there were also decisions in terms of hierarchical decisions in the healthcare system of who should access a PPE and who should not. And we can all only guess how some of these could end up. And that obviously also appeared when the COVID-19 vaccines were rolled out, and there were obviously a number of different gender-related factors related both to access as well as acceptancy and hesitancy of vaccines. And again, despite that we knew all of those differences, quite early on in the pandemic, the majority of the COVID-19 research remained rather gender blind. We carried out a systematic review early on and looking at clinical studies of COVID-19, and not only that the majority of them were not gender balanced, but it was rarely that the articles that they were publishing those findings disaggregated data by sex, considered sex and gender aspects in the analysis of the research, or even discussed remotely the implications of their finding from a gender point of view. And of course, that's not surprising if the evidence is not there. The majority of the COVID-19 related health policies were gender blind, as it was a report by the Global Health 50/50. So in summary, what we know so far is that we are really turning a blind eye to gender-blind research and reporting. Most studies lack consideration of sex and gender in design and are not gender balanced. Sex or gender of subjects are often not routinely reported. And if they are reported, they're often the baseline data or the demographics. The outcome data are rarely disaggregated by sex, and analysis often overlook important sex and gender dimensions, leading to overgeneralizations of finding. And that, of course, has a number of implications. One, that it can cause harm, and I will give examples to that, but also it can reduce reproducibility, which is a cornerstone of science. And as such, it can be a waste of research and as well compromise rigor. It is also a missed opportunity for innovation, and of course, it's about gender equality, health equity, as well as human rights. Now, just to give you a couple of examples about the harm, about 10 drugs were withdrawn from the US market between 1997 and 2001. And a study by the US government showed that 8 of them were withdrawn from the market because they were causing greater harm to women. 4 of them because of a greater experience of adverse event, which is likely due to biological differences in drug metabolism, and 4 of them because of gender-related consumption patterns. And in another instance, the Food and Drug Administration issued a drug safety communication recommending half a dose of the widely used drug Ambien, but only for women, because women actually needed only half a dose, and they metabolized the drug differently, eliminated the drugs differently. And it's really surprising that these are findings that are only noted when the drugs have undergone, again, ethical approval in terms of clinical research, and again, scrutiny of the regulatory agencies, and marketed and consumed by all of us. And with the growing and the rapid pace of development of AI and digital technologies for health, this huge gender data gap has the risk of perpetuating gender disparities and gender equality as they are being used to feed AI algorithms and AI models. And there is, again, studies are now coming out. A recent study showed that looking at different AI models in predicting liver disease, that the AI models missed 44% of liver diseases cases in women compared to 23% of men. And I'm sure there will be huge also racial and other biases within these models. So who is responsible to addressing the gender data gap? And that is a genuine question. All of us, obviously all of us. In the ecosystem of the evidence generation and in the research ecosystem, we have created, obviously, all of those checks and balances and gatekeeping functions to really uphold the rigor, reliability, and validity of science and the standards of science. We have funding bodies that, we go through evaluation of the proposals, ethical committees, the member states of the WHO, for instance, they have the responsibility of reporting the data, epidemiological data, journals and publishers which continuously peer review and evaluate the reporting of the data, and regulatory agencies. So we have all of those gatekeeping functions which all have a role, an important role, to maintain, again, ethical research, rigorous research, and research that can be replicable and reproducible. And why reporting matters, and I will focus on that specifically in light of talking about the SAGER guidelines, is that research contributes to the body of knowledge and evidence only after it has been peer-reviewed and published in often academic journals or by other technical publications. And editors have historically played an important role in terms of ensuring scientific rigor, enforcing ethical standards, and influencing what becomes part of the evidence base. So with that in mind, as Ines mentioned, as I was the editor of the Journal of the International AIDS Society, and of course HIV is yet another of the infectious diseases that is highly gendered and also influenced by sex differences, I introduced a gender policy in our journal in 2011. And then as I was elected as the member of the Council of the European Association of Science Editors, together with Ines and other colleagues, and we actually put together the East Gender Policy Committee over a coffee break. Again, the committee was established, and it was really born out of a shared concern about the gender bias in scientific research and reporting, and an agreement that science editors, as gatekeepers of science, could play an important role in changing the paradigm. And we all know that we all want to get published. And that's important metrics in our academic career as well. So in that sense, whatever editor says, authors usually do. And very soon after, we carried out an international survey, first of all, to see how many journals did have a gender policy in place, and I don't present those results. There were a handful of those. Half of them probably are journals. And also asking the attitude of if people thought that such a requirement could be included in the instructions to authors, and we were quite dismayed to see that 75% of the respondents, and we reached almost 500 journals, were either unwilling or unsure. And compared with the polls we saw, you said, "Oh my God, what a change!" So we still pushed forward, and together at a historical meeting, self-sponsored by all the GE's Gender Policy Committee members in Athens in 2014, I think it was, we developed the Sex and Gender Equity in Research Guidelines, the SAGER guidelines, which were following a consultative process, both online and in person at different conferences, was published in 2016. I will give you a very brief overview of the SAGER guidelines, but I do count on you going back and reading that, obviously using that in your work. So the SAGER guidelines were really developed to promote systematic reporting of sex and gender dimensions in research publications, but the recommendations are also applicable across the research cycles. And it's aimed to address the gender bias in research and data analysis overall and help bridging the gender evidence gap. It applies to all research with humans, with animals, with any material originating from them, and also in any field where its findings are applied to humans, including mechanics, engineering, as well as, of course, technology. And we really encourage authors to be mindful about the use of sex and gender in order to avoid conflating them, and I will talk a little bit more about that in the methodology. How are we doing time-wise? Okay, good. The SAGER guidelines are organized or structured based on an academic publications with title and abstract, introduction, methodology, results, and discussions. I won't go into every single recommendation, so I just give you I will focus mainly on the methodology, the method section, and the results section, which we think is quite important. In the method section, we encourage that authors should outline how sex and gender were considered or not in the study design, and how they try to ensure adequate representation, and if they were not adequate representation, justify the reasons for that. We strongly encourage transparent and complete reporting with clear and comprehensive details on data sources and methods for collecting sex and gender data. And that is quite important because of the, again, conflation of the terms and the use of sex and gender interchangeably. And from a scientific point of view, for the purpose of reproducibility and replicability, it is important to be clear about how data was collected. If you're talking about sex, was it based on genotyping? Was it based on legally recognized sex, or was it based on the self-reported sex assigned at birth? Or similarly with gender, whether it was a provider research-reported gender, or is it based on, again, medical records or self-reported gender identity? And that is, clearly important both to be relevant in terms of the purpose of the study and analytical approach, as well as to enhance accuracy, minimize confusion, and improve replicability, and support meaningful interpretation as well. Additionally, we suggest to have additional gender-related consideration that might not always be exposed through looking at sex disaggregation or looking at differences, including information about pregnancy, lactation, contraception, and menopause. And one example, again, is COVID, where none of the clinical research initially collected data on the impact of neither the infection nor the vaccines on menstrual cycle. And it was after a lot of women reported menstrual cycle disruption that came to the attention of the researchers, and additional research was carried out. And that can have implications in terms of vaccine acceptance or vaccine hesitancy as well, if there is not sufficient enough of knowledge around these issues. Similarly, with the COVID vaccines and the lack of sufficient and early data on safety and efficacy during pregnancy, which was a major cause for concern. But additional gender-related factors that can have an influence, including, again, decision-making, resource access and control of resources, service preferences, as well as gender-based violence. And again, one of the core recommendations is reporting of the data, and not only the demographic data, but also outcome data by sex, and carrying out to the extent possible, and the research design allows, sex and gender-based analysis, and reporting the outcome regardless of the positive or negative outcome. And if such analyses were not carried out, it's important to be able to provide an explanation or justification for not doing that. In terms of clinical trials, it is really important to report the clinical trials also by sex in terms of withdrawal, dropouts, and adverse event, and disaggregation by sex and gender, because they can also provide very meaningful information that is worthwhile thinking about. Now we have checklists and flowcharts for editors to really make sure that these can be easily implemented and used by authors and the editors. And we are absolutely delighted that after that initial resistance that we saw, that the SAGER guidelines have been accessed more than 1 million times and have been again translated into several languages. We welcome additional languages, so do reach out if you have an interest to translate them in additional languages. It is now part of the instructions for authors of the major prestigious publishers. They all cover more than 9,000 journals, including the ICMJE. And most recently, it was also adopted by the World Health Organizations with the support of the chief scientists, among others. And we are also supporting the WHO in implementation of the SAGER guidelines across its technical departments. And Eurosurveillance obviously was one of the first adopters and endorsers of the SAGER guidelines, as well as additional organizations increasingly adopting and implementing that, both in their publications policies, but also across their research aspects. Obviously, there is a lot of work to be done. We're still, having challenges of enforcing and implementing these guidelines and recommendations. And we do need to make sure that there is a collaboration and alignment with other gatekeepers, research funding agencies, ethics committees, regulatory agencies, and normative bodies. And just to say that this is definitely a collective effort with many amazing, again, researchers, champions, advocates that have really led to this widespread uptake and, again, continuous advocacy. Just want to draw your attention about the importance of these dimensions as we're also dealing with pandemics and outbreaks. And if you are aware that there is, international pandemic treaty being still continuously negotiated at the World Health Organization, and there is really an urgency to make sure that these considerations are included in those international binding instruments as early as possible, so we are not kind of repeating, at least learning our lessons. And with that, I thank you so much for listening and hand over to the coaches.
Thank you very much for that presentation. And now I'd like to introduce Gowri, Gopalakrishna from Maastricht University in the Netherlands. Again, for the interest of time, we're going to refer you to the bios of the speakers. But she's a co-author and shaper of the Cape Town Statement, which is a very important document on equity applicable to academic journals. So please, Gowri, we look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
So I have a burning question on my mind. How is the lunch? Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to Ines, Matthew, the organizers, for this warm welcome and invitation. I guess I should see my slides up there. Yes, there we go. Okay. So I was heartened to actually see on the word cloud many of the words that you won't see appearing again in my presentation. So hopefully that will actually resonate with you. I'll start actually with a few of my conflicts of interest. So as Matthew mentioned, I am a co-author on the Cape Town Statement, which I'll be speaking to, well, actually I'll be touching on it today. My views have been shaped by research on EDI as well as other experts who have spent a lot of time thinking about these issues, such as Shirin. But they are also influenced by my own personal experiences as a woman of color and a STEM researcher. So the outline of what you can expect while you're enjoying your fantastic lunch, I'll try not to be distracted by you eating this lunch. So I'll start my talk by actually going over some concepts on DEI, so diversity, equity, and inclusion. I will start actually by explaining what some of these concepts mean, but later in my talk I will refer to them more collectively as one entity and as a means to achieve equity and fairness in research. And then I will spend briefly, not as extensively as Sharon did, but I will spend a brief amount of time actually explaining the why. I think Sharon's done an excellent job for me. About why diversity, equity, and inclusion is important in the research process, and how we can actually actualize this in the research life cycle. And then I'll end with some concluding remarks. So I wanted to start off with briefly setting the scene on the terms that we use in our everyday language, but also in our writing. So I've come across a lot of literature and also in discussions where the terminology, words matter, the language that we use is important. And I've come across instances, quite a few instances, where equity and equality are used interchangeably when they actually really refer to different things. And I've had to educate myself on this, and so I thought it might be useful also to share some of this. So equality really stems from the belief that each individual or group of persons should be given the same resources or opportunities. So in the eyes of equality, this is really about giving both children that you see here on this diagram exactly the same ladder to access the fruit. But this is not helpful, clearly, to the child on the right. Equality will not allow the child on the right to get an apple for obvious reasons. The tree is slightly leaning towards the left, and it also has less fruit. So giving both children exactly the same ladder, in other words, being equal in the treatment of these two children, is not the solution. Equity, on the other hand, is about allocating distinct resources based on each person's needs. So in this example, what the child on the right actually needs is a different kind of ladder, a longer ladder, to access the fruit in the same way. What might be noteworthy here, which you might have already seen, is that equity alone cannot result in fairness if access to the fruit, which can represent resources, for example, in society, is unequally distributed to begin with. So similarly in research, we operate in systems that have long created and provided advantages to specific demographics and populations and unfairly excluded other demographics and populations. And often these tend to be vulnerable and marginalized groups. So the WHO defines equity as the absence of avoidable differences among groups of people, and these can be defined socially, economically, demographically, geographically, gender, as mentioned by Shirin. Race Matters Institute goes on further to actually say that equity can only be established when we treat everyone justly according to the circumstances in which they operate. Now, what about diversity? So the title of today's session is Diversity and Inclusion. So I'll spend just briefly actually giving you an explanation on the concept of diversity. So diversity is clearly about diverse representation, but it's not only about demographics, it's also in terms of ideas, in terms of methods, in terms of perspectives. But diversity in and of itself alone is not sufficient. Diversity must be accompanied by inclusion, which is really about providing an environment where diverse persons with different ideas, perspectives can be heard, respected, and valued. Because without inclusion, diversity is really an act of tokenism. So one can say that diversity is recruitment, and inclusion is about retention of that recruitment. Equity really underpins diversity and inclusion by correcting for systemic disparities. So why is all of this important? Why are we actually busy about this? Why are we advocating this? Well, I think the evidence is rife. Shirin has spoken a lot about the evidence that exists, which clearly shows that our research benefits a subset, namely the majority in our society. And there's rife evidence of this. Women and ethnic minorities are underrepresented in health research. We know increasingly that genomic and genomic studies, for instance, that form the basis of precision medicine are built on data predominantly of European descent. And it took a pandemic, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, to make the issue of medical devices like oxygen sensors, which positively discriminate oxygen 2 levels in darker-skinned individuals, a public health issue. So never waste a good crisis. I guess that's brought the necessary attention that we need to these issues. We also increasingly know that homogeneous research teams can have blind spots. They can introduce bias in formulating the research question, in overlooking critical aspects that are needed in the design, in the process, and the analysis of research, such that the research ends up answering questions for some groups and not others. We also increasingly know that more diverse and inclusive teams result in better innovation and therefore can improve the relevance and impact of the research that's done on policies that are derived from them. Now, what has all of this got to do with research integrity? I am a scholar of research integrity, and I was curious what that has to do with research integrity. You may say that that's obvious, and interestingly, research integrity has always been an innocent bystander on these issues. So traditionally, research integrity has been busy with ensuring that the highest methodological standards are met in research, where bias, defined in terms of research design, in terms of analysis methods, are minimized so that rigor and reproducibility is maximized. Now, while research integrity may seem to be an innocent endeavor, free of issues of inequity, lack of representation, and unfairness, but increasingly, statements like the Cape Town Statement and bias in research have started to be viewed more broadly. So science as such is not innocent in its endeavors, and biases do arise from every stage of the research life cycle, from those who set the agenda to those who determine what are the best methods to answer the question, how do we analyze and interpret these findings? In the 2017 version of the European Code of Conduct on Scientific Integrity, which was the first version of this Code of Conduct, there was no explicit mention of diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I'm glad to report that in the latest version, the revised version in 2023, there are 3 instances in which this is mentioned, which I guess is room for improvement, and largely due to the work on the Cape Town Statement. So regardless of our roles, as in this room there might be a mixed group of individuals, researchers, policymakers, funders, publishers, we can and must do, in my view, 2 things to support diversity, equity, and inclusion to result in fairness in our work. First, it's to critically question and, where possible, act to remove power imbalances in our processes, ways of being and knowing. And by that, I mean not just between high-income and low-income research groups, but also at the micro and meso level, so within our own research teams and organizations. Second, we should act to decolonize the research at each stage of the research life cycle, so that diversity, equity, and inclusion is front and center in how we formulate, conduct, and analyze our research. And this is exactly what the Cape Town Statement attempts to address by outlining a number of ways throughout the research life cycle which we can accomplish this. So starting with research agenda setting.
I think we can admit that as researchers, we tend to follow the money. To do research, we need funding, and that gives funders a lot of power. They have a lot of say in terms of what we research and how we do it. We need more funders that support low and middle income researchers directly without always needing high income researchers to be involved. Funders should also create dedicated funding opportunities for researchers of marginalized groups, but without making these calls impossible to reach. I once was part of a DEI funding call, or rather I was privy to this DEI funding call of a Dutch university. It was set out with the best of intentions, dedicated to supporting early career researchers of non-European descent. The stipulations, however, on the call were so high that it excluded immediately early career researchers who exactly needed this kickstart in their careers. Needless to say, that policy had sought no input from exactly the type of researchers it was aiming to help. Now, funding should also be explicitly allocated to capacity building. I think this is something that we often tend to miss, also in terms of the allocation of funding within our research groups, so that less resource partners are removed from the reliance on better resource partners. Funders should make explicit DEI policies, for instance, by requiring local community input pre- and post-study completion, by ensuring that teams are diverse but inclusive as well in their practices. Now, when it comes to defining the research question, research teams should be open to considering different perspectives, questions and methods other than the dominant ones. We need to look at health research from a broader disciplinary lens and consider other ways of knowledge production methods. Diverse teams can bring greater insight into variables which may traditionally not be considered as the dominant perspective. We need to address power imbalances within our teams and give weight to considering the needs of local communities where the research is conducted. When it comes to allocating funding, co-creation of indigenous-led knowledge production methods should play a role in our research, especially when that research involves working directly in these communities. Far too often, North-South collaborations are imbalanced in their research allocation and power relations, where team members from vulnerable or marginalized groups are relegated roles as support staff or data collectors. Budgets are often unfairly allocated due to the late involvement of such persons. Often I have been privy to PIs from high-income countries that have forgotten to include partners from low and middle-income countries until someone points out that's a requirement in the grant process, and then there is a last-minute scramble to look for such a partner. Open science practices are gaining traction, but they are also costly. We need to level the playing field in funding allocation so that less resource partners can also easily publish open access and have the infrastructure for open data sharing. How am I doing on time? Yeah. Now, coming to collecting, analyzing, and storing the data, teams that are not diverse may give less importance to collecting the data on marginalized or vulnerable groups for additional secondary analysis, which can be useful for addressing local research priorities which may not have been part of the original study. While I am an open science advocate, I think we also need to be cognizant that early open data sharing can marginalize less resourced groups from being the first to interrogate the data which they often have helped to collect. Inequitable infrastructure in terms of capacity often prevents less resource teams from downloading and analyzing large data sets. When secondary analysis are done by teams removed from the context in which the research is done, they may misinterpret findings. Most research does not consider local community perspectives, practices, or benefit sharing of their findings. The currency for research, frankly, is publications, and so most research tends to end there. Insufficient local input on research can lead to resistance and neglect local community concerns. One such case was a GMO-funded study by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in Uganda, where local community perceptions were not sought on GMO banana production methods that were being studied, and it led to a community which resulted in deep mistrust towards the research and the research team because they felt that their tradition and culture was not a part of the research process. Ethics Dumping, Case Studies from North and South Collaborations is a brilliant open access book that is freely downloadable where you can find more such case studies being discussed. Finally, at the end of the research cycle is where the rainbow ends for most of us, and that is the scientific publication. And that needs to be fair in its authorship practices. In 2020, Naidu et al. Published a study where they found that about 20% of African COVID-19 papers had no African authors, and 66% of papers on any topic in Africa had authors of non-African descent. Now, the same study also found that in papers with African authors, they were very often not the first or the last authors. And the same can be said for diverse peer reviewers. But beyond a publication, research needs greater societal benefit translation, particularly in marginalized or under-resourced communities where improvements are badly needed in health and medicine. So all of what I've actually just shared with you is contained in more detail in the Cape Town Statement, which you can freely download and find online, and I would hope that you would actually do that. To end with, I have some reflections. While the Cape Town Statement is heavily aimed at power imbalances between high and low-income countries, they remain very applicable, and I would like to emphasize that this setting is not necessarily the only setting in which the Cape Town Statement can make impact. It can also make impact within our European setting, within the teams that we operate in and the organizations that we work in. I also wish to acknowledge other initiatives that have addressed these concerns, one of which is the one that Shirin talked about, and there are a list of other initiatives as well that I think are inspirational to look at. I've listed them here. And finally, to conclude, the challenges are real that lay ahead of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and fairness. Measuring the impact of the Cape Town Statement, I think, is something that we've briefly discussed, is the direction that we would like to actually go. However, this is something that is still very new on the scene. It was created in 2022, so we're hoping that we'll go in that direction. We're also entering, in fact, we have actually already entered a political climate which will be very challenging for science and academia. And not only because we live in a post-truth era, but also because AI and similar tech may propagate existing biases in our knowledge base. And it is absolutely crucial that we recenter the scientific evidence so that it is representative to all of our society. And finally, I want to give a nod to Lynn Horn, who is the lead author of the Cape Town Statement, and my fellow co-authors. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of the speakers for giving us a good ride through important topics in a very few minutes only. And without further ado, because we have the chance to discuss with you, I think we give the people in the room the first chance. Is there someone who has a burning question? We have a microphone in the room, and please stand up.
Hi, my name is Dr. Saeed Ahmed. I'm a doctoral researcher at Tampere University in Finland. And Gowri, thank you very much for fantastic presentation and bringing up a very important issue, very relatable to myself as well. But my quick question is regarding impact factor of the journals. When we talk about impact factors, I really don't know what is the rationale, how you say that impact factor is so high, what are the parameters behind that. But is the diversity and inclusion is one of the parameters to rate the impact factor of a journal? Yes or no? If it is not, is there any effort being made to align or incorporate such a wonderful diversity and inclusion to be a parameter of an impact factor of a journal? Thank you very much.
This is not working? Okay. That is an excellent point. Thank you for that comment. I think at the moment, as far as I am aware of, journals are not based, impact factor of journals are not based on diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. But that would definitely be a direction that I would be very much in favor of. There is a strong movement, at least in research integrity, to stop looking at impact factors of journals and to actually really move towards an open sharing of knowledge. So through preprints, for instance, we saw that as the main mode of sharing knowledge in the COVID-19 pandemic, but also to make research a lot earlier and easier to share. And it's not the purpose of this meeting to actually discuss issues around peer review. It is usually the stamp of approval of rigorous research, however, not always so. But I'm not going to discuss the problems in that system. But I think when we talk about impact factors, at least within the research integrity community and responsible research practices, we're really wanting to move away from looking at impact factors. But if we were still to discuss and consider impact factors, I think those would be great markers to include.
If we start talking about impact factors, we'll really have a long list of issues to discuss about.
There's a lot of controversy about how impact factor is derived. Other questions from the floor? Yes, please.
Hello, thank you very much for the amazing presentations. I wanted to ask you your point of view on a question that we had on the talk at the beginning. So do you think that we should include race as a variable in all studies or not? Thank you.
Oh. Well, that's an excellent question. I mean, even with the SAGER guidelines, there is not a must. We are opening a door for a dialogue to give a rationale why these issues needs to be considered and why they're important. So there is nothing a must in anything, but it's highly encouraged to try to make sure that the research is as diverse as possible. Now, obviously, there is always methodological limitations of how many variables can you include in one study, but that doesn't limit us to conducting different studies or prioritizing populations that have been historically underrepresented. So there is really an encouragement, both from a scientific and, of course, a public health and equity lens, to try to rethink the way we have done research in the past, to consider more, again, equity, the lens of equity, and I think that's why Gowri's presentation was so, again, resonating with us, that we really need to rethink how we are thinking around research in terms of inclusion, diversity, recruitment, representation, and they might not all fit into one single research study, but I think as a broader research community, we really need to diversify what is being done. I don't know if that's really any helpful.
So just to add actually to what Shirin says, which I completely agree with, I would actually turn the question around and ask, why wouldn't I include race or ethnicity in this research? And by not doing so, how might my research exclude certain groups to which this may be applicable?
I think from some perspectives, at times, there's a difficulty also, and this has been alluded to already yesterday in one of the presentations. We are limited by the amount of data that we are allowed to collect in certain instances. So it's really important that you reflect on which data, which variables you could collect at the onset of your study and why you collect them. And so I think in this context, it's so important to be aware of your biases, of your blind spots, to see whether or not, if you do or you don't collect a variable, this impacts on your research, on what you want to research, and who your research will be meaningful for. That's my opinion, and this is why why I think it depends is really the answer to this, because not one size fits all.
Can I add one quick thing as well? I also think we collect immense amount of data that we don't report. So I think there is also a lot of waste of research of the data we are sitting in that is not reported, nobody has access to, which could help in, again, pooled analysis, meta-analysis of different kinds. So we also have a work to do in terms of just sharing that data.
Just a quick comment on this. From a journal perspective, there was an allusion to helicopter research. We certainly discourage that and look to make sure that the authors reflect the research and on the ground. And concerning some of the other issues in the poll, we do look at and think very carefully about diversity on all the levels in a journal: authors, reviewers, associate editors, and editorial board. The challenge is a sort of hyper-specialization in medicine and research, which, there's only two people who know this topic, but unfortunately that also leads to stagnation in advances in knowledge. So it's something that we certainly struggle with. Let's move to some questions online.
I'm aware that you have more questions in the room, but we also have people online joining us and trying to be giving them also some representation here. We have two questions. Oh no, we have more questions. One question is from Sophia Igioli, and she has a question, I think, that's about sex and gender and race are typically considered sensitive information. So it ties in with what I said in a way. Often not asked because ethical committees, and she puts that in quotation marks, do not like this. So after the publishing of the guidelines, what feedback did you hear as obstacles presented to people why these information were not collected? So it's a bit of another element to what we've discussed before. Who wants to take the floor?
Who wants to go first? Okay. First of all, just to say that we are developing a SAGER guidelines tailored for research ethics committees, and we organized a full-day meeting last year together with CIOMS, which is the Council for the ones that develop the international guidelines on research with human subjects. And there is a lot of appetite from research ethics committees who I think have come around, perhaps from that point of view. I also think that we actually always collect data on sex. It's just a matter of reporting to what extent people have in the past hesitated from reporting that data, but there is also a lot of change coming from that. I think, the issue about confidentiality, anonymity always goes back to the specific study and the specific research and, of how much data can you share that would potentially have the risk of identification. And that's, again, a case-by-case analysis that needs to be done.
I have another online question, and the question is from Daria Bucci, who says, I would be interested to hear your perspectives on the matter of building capacities and discuss, capabilities, and discuss potential strategies for enhancing and equalizing research capabilities in the coming years with the goal of fostering research leadership within low and middle income countries rather than it being predominantly led by the global north.
Sorry, Ines, I missed the question in that. That seemed to me more a comment that I fully agree with. Absolutely, I think that was actually one of my key points, that we actually need to provide more dedicated funding so that low and middle income researchers are not always in reliance. There will be a certain phase, but we should work towards discontinuing this absolute reliance for research to be always involving a high and middle income country, which is kind of the default setting at the moment with many of the European funders.
Let's go back to the floor. Are there questions? Yes.
Yes, I think I was before you. Teija Korhonen from ECDC. This might be a bit of a sidetrack, but I think this is also related to open access and preprints, at least after the pandemic, and at least the people that I've been following that I have kind of started to really look up to, like Alastair Munro from UK, pediatrician. I think he wrote just a couple of weeks ago a good essay or column about that we don't necessarily need more science, we need more good quality science. And the social media and the media world where we are living in seems to be quite good picking up on the bad science, at least from my point of view. And I think this is a bit of a sidetrack, but important point. Thank you.
Absolutely. And thank you for actually mentioning that. I think in relation to the comment also on impact factors, I can understand that traditionally vulnerable and marginalized groups of researchers may still actually default on the impact factor argument while you're still, or an early career researcher who's still trying to actually build their CV, be noticeable, get equal funding opportunities. So I'm fully behind this responsible research practice, which is actually essentially what it's defined. We need better quality research and we need less actually quantity of research and more quality. And speaking to that, the research integrity community, has put out quite a few statements. So the Hong Kong statement, which came out in 2018, was really focused on this issue. Of trying to move the metrics-focused way of rewarding and recognizing researchers to actually a more narrative sort of way, and look at other markers such as mentorship and supervision, adoption of open science, even though I think that there are some disadvantages there that we need to be careful of. But I also feel that it is something, that it is a practice that needs to start, I think, from those who have had privilege already and those who have achieved positions of seniority in research. And that trend or that moving of the needle needs to start from there.
I couldn't agree more. I just think we really need to disconnect publications as a metrics of productivity. I think that is really the drive of all these bad quality publications and salami publications, just because there is that incentive that goes with funding, career development, and so on and so forth. And we all as editors know how easily manipulated that system is.
Yeah, I'll just say, as far as impact factor, it creates a positive feedback loop because, it's all based on how many references, how many citations that a publication has. And if people are just looking for research from a certain demographic, it's just going to compound. So that's really the issue with impact factor.
I think from the questions I've seen Ottilia, and then I've seen Susan, and then I've seen you. Oh, Helena, sorry. Apparently Alina paid better attention than I did. Sorry for that.
That's why you have these people around here to actually support you. So thanks, Alina. No, thanks. Actually, I could not agree more with the last sentences and the last points, actually, also from Teija and from you. We are looking actually at ECDC. My name is Elena Carvalho Gomez from ECDC. Also, how can we actually measure the impact of our work and also the impact on public health beyond metrics, because they are easy to measure, but they are not necessarily what shows actually the impact. But the point that I wanted actually to make is that we talk now a lot about research, and for some people, research is when you do a study, etc., and we tend to forget actually, for example, routine data that we are collecting, surveillance, and I think the discussion on personal data and which type of data we are collecting already on a in a routine way, I think those discussions need to happen much more. There are a lot of concerns, of course, I mean, for historical reasons partly, particularly also in Europe, which type of data we are collecting and how the data could actually be used or misused. So I think, I don't know, is it time also for areas like surveillance to have something like an ethics committee, etc.? Because very often these type of data analysis actually does not need to undergo an ethics approval, for example. So can we actually learn also from primary research? I don't know. Do you have an opinion actually there?
I can add a little bit of that. Just a disclosure that through GENDRO, we also work very closely with WHO's Gender Equity and Rights Department. So a lot of the work of WHO is also not necessarily only on research, it's also specifically on data that is being also reported from countries, as also surveys and surveillance and so on and so forth. So we are really trying to implement the SAGER guidelines recommendations, not only on empirical research, but also on any kind of systematic collection of data and data analysis. And there is a huge gap. There is, both with regard to the SDGs, health-related SDGs, as well as, a lot of the epidemiological data within WHO. There is a huge gap. I think there's a lot of gaps in terms of reporting, necessarily collection. I think it probably happens, but there is a lot of work that needs to be done there. I don't know in terms of ethics, but I think, normative agencies such as WHO, ECDC, CDC have an important role to play to driving that agenda.
There was a question on the right side of the room here, or my right?
I have done several systematic reviews in my life, and I always observe that there is a geographical bias. There is also a language bias, and I can totally understand which are the factors behind this. I'm just wondering if there could be like a better line or balance between some journals being actually, let's say, a kind of a business, isn't it? And actually finding support to encourage publications from countries where paying 6,000 euros, it's prohibitive. Yeah, this was my point, maybe. There are some mechanisms.
Well, certainly journals have to pay their bills. So for the example of my journal, Emerging Infectious Diseases, were published by CDC. We have no fees either for authors or readers. So we're truly open access, but the expenses are paid for by the U.S. taxpayers. So that's a very different model for most journals. But in the end, I mean, journals want to create the best content. And the best way to do that is to have a diverse array of authors. So,
May I add? Go ahead, Ines.
Yep.
I mean, of course, there are a number of diamond open access journals, and it's pretty, I think these are the avenues that maybe people could look for. But also, I mean, one important role is also to ensure, aside from geographical, and that's something that we keep discussing with our board, aside from geographical distribution, you also need to publish meaningful results, and that can be taken forward for that show implementation of measures that work. And so you also have this element which is unfortunately not always easily described in some areas. And so this is where capacity building and just it's a learning process. And I think we can see already, at least in our analysis, and we've done some self-critical analysis recently, how well we do for our journal. And we're not as brilliant as we should be, maybe, but we're realizing we're making progress. While people are moving away, in the interest of time, I think, Susan, you were really the next one, and then it was up to you, and then I think I would make we can take the questions and answers very quickly, and then we have to conclude because people are walking away.
If I only can add, because I edited 2 journals for which I negotiated with big open access publishers, and I have a huge concern about the lack of scrutiny of the publishing business as a model. There is a lot of profit going into that business, and I do understand the need of covering the costs, and I'm not talking about journals that are really covered by non-for-profit entities. I think there's a huge problem in that. I just want to say that I totally agree, and I think there is really a niche for questioning that model altogether.
And maybe just to jump in and actually say that with the move, of open science, that preprint sharing, is also a way around this. And we saw a lot of that research, as I mentioned earlier in COVID-19, that was really the way that main research was actually being shared, while there were some delays in what happens in journals. But also the journal peer review process, is or can be a treacherous black box. And it's not necessarily the stamp of approval that it gives, and there are a whole host of problems there. So I think going alternative, ways of publishing your research and looking at post-publication review. So review by the scientific community is also something I think that we need to actually increasingly adopt as a practice.
Predatory journals is a whole nother session.
Oh, yeah.
But, be careful about and look into, who you submit to. Yeah. Next question, please.
Thank you. So my name is Suzanne Hané from the Netherlands. I'm now the senior editor of the journal Epidemiology and Infection. So I will certainly look at EASE and at all the guidelines and statements, and I really support, of course, the representativeness and the fairness. But my question is about, is there a risk? Because I think the examples are very convincing from clinical medicine, the treatments, the diagnostics in the darker skin color. But in epidemiology, it's all about proxies and finding the right proxy for your outcome. And if you are forced to report proxies like country of origin or income level, that may not be the best proxy for your outcome, you're at risk of increasing stigmatization and marginalization. So did all of your statements consider risks of this in epidemiological research? We are struggling with this in the Netherlands at the moment with a particular example that I won't go into, but it's just a question.
That's a very good question.
Yeah, that's a great point. Just to understand actually the question that you mentioned, could you give us a concrete example that you've actually
if you look
with?
at vaccine coverage, for example, and you split that by country of origin, you may be stigmatizing groups, whereas in fact it's lack of trust or there's other things underneath. And then you point to the country of origin as the risk factor, but in fact it's other things going on. And it could be the same with sex or gender. I wonder what.
So if you just stick to the pure reporting of the results, just so that I understand actually what really the issue is, that would always obviously actually be or should actually be included with an interpretation and an analysis of these findings in a way that is encompassing where these issues might be originating from, such as, for instance, the historical deep mistrust in marginalized communities towards the medical establishment.
But oftentimes,
I mean, putting the findings in context, I guess, I mean, they need to go hand in hand.
Yeah, but often that context is lacking. We don't know. But I guess for time reasons, you need to...
I just really agree with you because I'm doing also research and we are very mindful about that risk, and that's why I think we also really need to make sure that our quantitative research is always accompanied by a qualitative research that really puts those because again, with quantitative research, you might find disparities, but you don't know the underlying causes unless you actually do qualitative research. And we have really undervalued qualitative research in epidemiology, in public health to a great extent, and we really need to go back to that. Yep.
Okay.
But I don't think, excluding those data is not really the solution.
Can we have one final question? Because I will conclude very quickly after this, but that's the one final question and maybe a short answer. Because I think the other sessions may move on now.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name's Nicola Lohm from the University of Bern in Switzerland. So much to discuss in this session. It's been really fantastic. It's a comment rather than a question, but I will phrase it as a question, is where do you see the education coming from for young researchers about the understanding of the issues about what is sex, what is gender. Actually, from this, I was a bit disappointed that you put the question is, should we include race? But what about ethnicity? So you have a biologically grounded one and a socially grounded concept, and it really goes back to what, well, it sort of touches very heavily on what Susan has just said, which is about there's a big problem with education, and education about what are these concepts and how to report them, not just to automatically, mechanically include them in an analysis, but to actually say what you're doing and understand what you're doing. Yeah. Thank you.
Chapeau, I totally agree. I could not agree more. I think we should start in kindergartens. I don't think we should even start in universities, already too late. And again, I think another hopeful aspiration that we kind of continue doing this work, also applying that to medical education, but also, again, curricula across, because there is a huge bias in representation. There are studies about showing how all the anatomies in medical books are based on male models and so on and so forth, just to keep it short, but yes.
Okay, with this I think a lot has been said, and it was very interesting, and thank you all for staying with us and bearing with us. The session started later, ended a bit later, but I think it was worth it, and the interest that you've all shown in the room shows that this is an important topic. And I think it's also, as Piotr mentioned earlier, we sometimes have timely topics, and we're all interested to not make diversity, equity, and inclusion buzzwords, right? And in the present climate that we are entering, it's very important that we're all aware and that we're all strong on showing what we miss out if we don't consider these principles in our day-to-day work, and how important it is that we are aware that we must show times and again what the benefits and gains are. I think this is what is now relevant for everyone, and based on raising awareness, training people, and making people understand how important this is. And I think the good example, we had a good example, really, when Shirin in 2011 cat-herded us over a coffee break, and I was a bit all the time like, I was the skeptical one. I was there to not let this go too far in one direction and being more skeptical. This was my starting point, and I have really changed my perspective quite a bit, and you can see we're sitting all here, and it's showing that a model can work. And Shirin, as the really spearhead of this, not letting it loose, has a strong vision and has a mission and a vision, and it shows how you can change, you can really make an impact by persistence and sticking to what your values are and what you think is important. Because this was a long run, but WHO has endorsed the SAGE guidelines, which is quite something to do. And maybe we can all go back and reflect a little bit if we can convince some people in our organizations and institutes to think about endorsing the principles stronger than they do at the moment. And with this, have a very good afternoon. Thank you for joining our seminar. And if you like our journal, sorry, Matthew. No, we're conducting a reader survey because as Eurosurveillance, we want to remain relevant also in the future. But to remain relevant for the public health infectious disease community, we need to know what you expect from us and what you like and what you don't like. So there is a QR code at our stand. There's a QR code in front of the door. Please help us spread the word around the survey and give us as many responses as we can have so we know what is important for you in the future. And with this, thanks again. A big round of applause to our